Thank you very much. I want to start by saying that what I've heard before me is both, it's reassuring that we're not the only ones out there to hear that you guys have accomplished what you're doing. You're facing a lot of the same challenges trying to address specific issues and are doing it successfully. I think that the only thing I don't like about it is it's going to be a little bit repetitive because your issues are our issues. I will give everyone who's interested the specifics of our program, the Alameda County Justice Restoration Project, but I don't want to get into the details of that. I noticed that you guys have stayed clear of particular eligibility criteria because every jurisdiction has its own needs and own issues to address. But it's all available, and I could talk to you endlessly about it. Um, Again, I share the commitment that all of you guys express. And with me today on the call are Lisa Adams and Douglas Butler. Those are two individuals who are my colleagues in the DA's office, who are my core staff. We've expanded now, so I'm also in charge of all the collaborative courts. But I started ACGRP at Nancy's assignment. And what we have learned from that, although it doesn't complete until August, um, has been instrumental in making all of our programs better. But in the breakout sessions, you'll have a chance to talk to Lisa and Doug. The important thing to know is this: Nancy O'Malley hired both of them as part of this model. Both of them have significant time in incarceration and lived experience. After the time they got out of prison, they demonstrated their strength in the community so that when Nancy hired them, she knew exactly what their strengths were. And they're extraordinary people with extraordinary strengths, and I couldn't do my job without them. So I just want to say that out front, and it covers everything. It's not just being a peer support specialist, which they're trained in. It's not just they have great community access to housing and other resources, or can liaison with our community-based program servers. It's they're great thought partners dealing with policy and where we should be in the office. That is the title we have. My department is realignment and policy. Realignment is basically, I think, what the New York example that Nicole was talking about is that we had a sea change in around 2010, 2013, where California laws changed dramatically. And those laws, although they were well intended, have in many ways made things more difficult as have made things more lenient in the criminal justice system. The good news is that they calculated that by sending fewer people to prison, which is nothing this county ever did unless it was absolutely appropriate, serious violent felonies. Nonetheless, they've taken that money and redistributed it, making a lot of our funding issues available. The one thing I want to indicate, because it's part of our core, is that this is a pay for success project. ACGRP was initiated by grant funding, but it also required that we get individual funding from the private sector to be attractive enough to them where they would invest their money on a pay for success model, meaning if we do not succeed in lowering recidivism, they don't get paid. And that can be millions of dollars in losses. Other programs have not succeeded in this area of reducing recidivism. And our county administrator was very aware of that. So when we took this on and making a change, there were a lot of people who were justifiably skeptical that this could be done, where we'd actually prove that we reduced recidivism with an independent evaluator. And before that, before we even had a program that would succeed, we had to attract funding. We have done it with an intermediary, and I'm not saying intermediaries are going to necessarily be relevant to this group, but they have been very helpful. Third sector got us funding. I will say this: originally, the whole thing about funding was not part of our dialogue because COVID had not hit and the emergencies created by it had not set in. Now, all of a sudden, I'm thinking, along with some of our other talk groups we've had with the Prosecutors Center for Excellence, we all have to think what are we doing now? And one of the things I think we're all in agreement about is that as funding becomes precarious, we're noticing that even though this is a great program, we get none of the money as prosecutors. We lead it, we invented it, we designed it, we're running it and overseeing it day by day, and yet we get none of the funding. So I think that one of the things we want to learn about is if we're so good as we have been in making this work, and I'll just throw this out there that we had a contractual requirement of overperforming and reducing recidivism by 15% against an identical control group, which was selected by the independent evaluator. If we didn't meet that target, the funder would stand to lose money. If it went down to losing percentages or anything approaching zero, similarly, the funder would be missing out in millions of dollars. So the point there is that now more than ever, I think we as prosecutors need to think about, since we are leaders, we need to think about making sure that people don't fund us just to be putting people in jail, but make sure they give us the necessary funds to do the role that they hold us accountable for. A penal code reform group in Sacramento, for instance, was very quick and, by the way, accurate to say that with great responsibility, or with great power goes great responsibility. That does fit what a prosecutor has. And I remember hearing that first by a very left-wing oriented and famous defense attorney who was teaching criminal law. And that was his point. If you want to make a difference in the world, don't be a defense attorney or a judge. The power lies with the prosecutors. That is proved in my experience to be extremely true. But with that responsibility, we need funding. And I mention that again, not because that's what our county's position is specifically. We have funding sources, but it's one of those things that when we're expected to achieve these good things, that could be endangered with lack of funding. The other thing I want to point out is that this whole ACGRP is by design in competition with the rest of what we have in place in Alameda County. And for decades, we've had many different diversion programs, everything from drug court to giving felons a chance to avoid even maybe a charge or certainly a conviction. And that goes back 3 decades or more. So we have a long history, and including something like 13 other programs right now. So when we have to overperform, we're performing against an already robust network of available programs. What's interesting is that obviously, as we come up with innovations that are really good and working for ACGRP, we have to think about the consequence as we have to overperform by contract. And yet at the same time, we certainly want other people to borrow the ideas that we are presenting and publicly presenting so that they can immediately implement them. So you can see the dilemma there, maybe, that we want them to succeed. We don't want to affect, be like holding back a vaccine to get an advantage on it. So anyway, the whole essence of ACGRP is to use peer support specialists. D.A. O'Malley's idea was that if you can have a way of better engaging our criminal population that would be defined as those who have committed a non-violent, non-serious felony created by the state of California as a special category in 2013, how then, if we can do that, how then do we make a difference by not just giving them favorable plea agreements or putting them in an existing court, collaborative court? What can we do better? And the key to that was peer support specialists, where you meet them on their own terms, you actually listen to them, you have a flexibility where you're not tied down to conventional ways of thinking about things. One thing D.A. O'Malley said is we need to own these failures. We don't want to say, what did they do wrong or keep doing wrong in this cycle of recidivism? But looking in the mirror, what can we do as government, or specifically maybe even as DAs, to make things better? And The answer seems very clearly based on our 29% recidivism rate reduction we currently have, and we're very close to the end, meaning we've basically performed over 200% what our maximum goal was when we drafted the reasonable expectations that this county could have had given the population we have. So anyway, this is already looking like a real success story. Ideas of ours have already been borrowed and implemented as we go. And I want to mention that
Eric, you have 5 minutes, and I know you were kind enough not to want to give us your eligibility, but can you just give us a little dose of what the eligibility is for this program?
absolutely, it's for those who are 18 to 34. And get this, and instead of not having a criminal record, we insist that they have at least one felony conviction. And the more, the better, as long as it's not a violent or serious felony, which is actually disqualifying. So we want to take on the toughest population possible. And that was designed by the people who helped us at the Harvard Kennedy School, the Government Performance Lab. We educated them on the criminal law aspects of it so they knew what they were talking about. And they selected out of our Alameda County population the highest risk group we could find. And that has two advantages. We see whether we can work under the toughest circumstances, and yet at the same time, it gives us a chance to overperform. A lot of people aren't going to recidivate anyway without an intervention. But the other criteria is it's for men and women. It's for basically those are the limitations. They have to need the intervention as demonstrated by the fact they can't stay out of trouble. And they often have many misdemeanor convictions. One thing we found is we're looking for actual misconduct because we're cleaning people's records so aggressively in California, and especially in Alameda County. We have to make sure that we're not saying, well, everybody has a clean record because of our efforts that way. We're actually looking at what the person's conduct has been in the past, because that's what's really indicative of where the need is. I will say this, it's been a big, just like so many of you have said before, at the very beginning, we brought people in to say, where is the need? That included judges, public defenders, probation, the sheriff. The sheriff has given us unprecedented access to people in the jails, or I should say in the courtrooms. Nobody can get into the jails effectively. So we made an arrangement where, because of my experience in the courtrooms, we thought, well, let's just talk to people in the courtrooms when they come to court. It's again a matter where they get a deferred entry of judgment if they succeed, and the criteria for failure is an arrest. We wish it had been a higher standard, like something like a charge, but in California, our Department of Justice data, which our independent evaluator got independent access to through our getting them certified, has to be that, because otherwise it would be a problem, because we just don't have good statewide data right now. But for giving people their deferred entry of judgment, even though we haven't succeeded in our plan to keep people from recidivating as defined, I made a caveat that if they don't get charged again, I'll still give them their deferred entry of judgment, because that's a fair estimate of how they've really performed.
And if you could just give us 1 minute on how your peer, Lisa and Doug, who are on this call, how they interact with the people who are participants in this program. What do they do day to day?
What they do is essentially provide that support for the people who are providing the support. We have a contracted entity called La Familia who provides they're the service provider. We all, Lisa, Doug, and I, are there for them because those are all persons who are dealing with their own issues as being recently incarcerated and having criminal records. So our direct impact is not to supervise or do that. We're kind of, what do you call it, providing peer support for the peer support specialists. And the three of us actually went through the rigorous training to get that certification. I'd always known that those were good values, but there's nothing like participating side by side with the people to see what great concepts are out there through these peer support national certification entities like RI out of Arizona.